Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to our discussion on race and racism. Let's get back into it. So, racism, right? What is it? So now we're going to look at some of the aspects of racism. How does it get executed? How do we see it enacted, and how would we see it in other places? Racism itself, for all intents and purposes, is about power, right? It's about control. It's about ideology. It's about culture. It's about how I see you, how do I make you an other, and how do I gain from it? And that really is sort of what racism is about. It's about um, placing someone above someone else. Now, even though we might look at how racism is sometimes done, at sort of that lower level, the individual level, we might not see that same sort of stratification. But racism isn't just about that base level of the individual experience. It's about all the things above it that um, sort of demonstrate that level of control. So individual racism is a set of beliefs and practices that are prejudiced against someone that is different from yourself. These can be negative actions or by not taking any sort of action that could have a positive impact. So, negative actions or inaction that could have a positive impact. So, um, even the idea of like you see something racist happening and you don't engage in stopping it, right? Because that is sort of in essence thinking about um, accepting, right? If you're not getting pushback from that sort of behavior, um, you become complicit in it. That's a difficult thing to think about, right? How many times have you seen an injustice taking place, and how do you engage in that conversation or that action? Um, Not an easy subject to think about or consider. So, how do we see it? How do we view that kind of stuff? Then we have things like microaggressions. Microaggressions can be sometimes doing something very small, something minor. Say you're sitting in your car and down the sidewalk in front of you, two black guys are walking. Now, the likelihood of them doing something to you is really slim, but you still lock that door, right? Because maybe they don't have the cleanest look to them, right? Maybe they don't have uh, the the most civilized look, and you're just a little bit suspicious, and you're just out of safety. Just out of safety, I'm going to just lock that door. And they see that. Now, they're just two dudes walking down the street, right? They're just, you know, maybe they're going out to lunch, and the restaurant they're going to is right around the corner, and they're just walking there. But they see that behavior of you locking that door, and that has a mental impact on them. That has an emotional impact. That has something that's, even though it's minor, it's just like a paper cut, right? It's not being slashed, it's not being jabbed, it's just paper cut, right? But those paper cuts, they build up, right, over time. Those little tiny things that happen, a courtesy not given based on their race, right, can start having a detrimental impact. An interesting example of this might be let's say you go to your favorite restaurant, and um, let's say you're a waiter at that restaurant, and you're a white guy, and you have a black family that comes in. And in the past, you have experienced that black families don't tip out as well as other families. Okay. And you're like, you know what? They're not going to tip me as well, but I've got this family over here and that family over there, and I know they're going to tip me better. So I'm going to spend more time working on them, right? And less time working with them, because in my past, that's what I've experienced. And so when their food comes up, it takes a little bit more time for that food to get out to their table. And when their cup runs dry and they're waiting for a refill, it takes a little bit longer for that refill to come. And at the end of the night, when you give them the ticket and they give you that payment, and that payment includes a smaller tip, it reinforces your belief that they don't tip as well, despite the fact that their service wasn't as good, right? And so accordingly, they would be tipping what your service was equal to. But every time that happens, right, that reinforces some sort of a belief, and it's cyclical, right? It happens over and over again, and it reinforces those ideologies about how people behave and how people experience things, right? So even though it's not intentional, right, you're not intentionally doing something as a disservice, you kind of are, right? But it's not minor, it's not overt. You're not calling anyone any racial names or anything like that, but that experience still has an impact, right? And when those kids grow up and they remember that whenever they went to that restaurant and that was the service that they got, maybe they don't go back to their restaurant, or maybe they see things differently, and it impacts them on how they are going to spend their time and their money. And maybe that knowledge becomes institutionalized, right? And it impacts how they end up seeing the world. Even though it was just a minor thing, right? It still has that long-lasting impact. And we oftentimes ignore those little things, right? As a part of our culture, we don't see those little things that impact everybody, even on those minor levels. And, well, do we have control over that? Yes. Yes, we do, right? We absolutely have control over, but we oftentimes don't recognize that control exists, because we don't oftentimes recognize that there's a problem there in the first place, because it becomes normalized, right? That's important to understand, is that oftentimes when we're dealing with microaggressions and racism, that it becomes normalized. It becomes a part of the everyday culture of language, right? Of how we engage in institutions, right? All of this stuff becomes important. Okay, continuing. Institutional racism. Now, this is one of the main ways that racism is still actively engaged in, right? We don't see the same levels of individual racism that we have in the past. We don't see as much microaggressions as we have in the past, and that's because generations today grew up with multicultural ideals and having friends from all around the world in different ethnicities and cultures, and they grew up in a way that I'm not a racist. I've never been a racist, right? I don't have that kind of ideology. And so a lot of people who grew up that way, and this is still an issue, say, well, I'm not a racist. I don't see racism take place in my normal everyday life, so it doesn't exist. I don't see it anymore. And that itself is a problem, right? I've known quite a few people that experience, even talking about like police brutality, right? Every interaction they've ever had with a police officer has been a pleasant one. And even myself, as a white guy, every time I've had an interaction with a police officer, I have never had to once worry about being sent to jail or being handcuffed or being frisked or any of those things because of the color of my skin, right? That's just something that doesn't exist for me. And I, was rowdy when I was a kid and have dealt with the police in the past, but I never had that worry. I didn't have that institutional concern that because of my race, I had to be concerned about how to interact with those people. So, right, we have this institutional racism, and we've seen this, and there's lots of documentation on it when it comes to social justice, when it comes to the criminal justice, how people are incarcerated at different rates. And sometimes there's justification that goes along with it, right? Well, we see more African Americans in jail per capita than we do um, white Americans because they do more crime. Well, there might be a little bit of truth to that. The question is why is there more crime? Is it innate that they are more criminal? No. No, what it ends up being is because it's a cultural after effect, right? If you think about communities that live in poverty, why are those communities in poverty? Well, they haven't worked hard enough to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, or to they just have to put enough effort in. But let's just say in this community that was segregated off by first segregation or an HOA, which ultimately was designed as an after effect of segregation. Homeowners associations were first developed around the idea of keeping racial diversity, right? That's what HOAs were first. They still do that, right? Not to the same extent, but it's still used in that way. So, right, there are still mechanisms that are put into place where people of a certain race or ethnicity weren't giving as much access, right? If you think about schools, right? Even funding for schools has been done in a way that has been seen as to be racist or institutionally racist. Part of that has to do with performance, right? If you're living in a school district that values performance, well, that performance is often directly related to resources. Can you get the right books? Can you get up-to-date books? Can you get after-school programs? Can you hire good teachers, right? What level of teaching do you have? What kind of resources do you have for food, right? For lunch programs? What about the water? What about the safety of the school? Is it in good condition or is it poor? All of those things help to condition people, right? If they've got good resources, access to good resources, they do better. If an institution is put into place that doesn't allow that, right? If you have all of those things going on and those students who are experiencing, they don't have enough access to food, right? So maybe they have to go to the corner market and steal, right? Maybe they have to go to the grocery store and steal food or steal resources or commit a crime, some sort of robbery, because why does anyone commit robberies? It's not because they are rich and wealthy, especially not on that level, right? We're talking about a different kind of criminal there. Most do it because they need the resources, so they don't have access to it. Because their parents grew up so poor that they don't want to live that same sort of lifestyle. And they don't see a way out, right? All of that can be attributed to how we organize our institutions, education, churches, religion, right? Our criminal system, right? What happens when you start having your fathers taken away to jail and you don't have a positive male role model in your life? That can be an issue, right? Same way if your mother is gone. Having multiple positive influences in your life more is better, right? But if you're fighting every day to survive, right, you start seeing problems. So we start seeing things like racial inequity in modern times because of, again, legacy. Okay, and I want to talk about legacy here for a moment. Let's go back to the Civil War. Okay, so interesting fact. The last Civil War veteran to die, okay, the last person that fought in the Civil War died in 1956. Okay, 1956. That's surprising, right? Because the Civil War was fought in the 1860s, right? But this person joined early. I think they were like 13 when they joined in the war and then survived all that time. Now, this is an interesting thing to think about. I remember speaking to my grandfather, right, who, if he were still alive, would be in his mid-90s. I remember when I was talking to him as a kid, and he told me how he had witnessed parades when he was a child. And in these parades, and this was in the 1930s and 40s, they had survivors from the Civil War. Just like we would have in our parades World War II veterans and now Korean veterans and Vietnam War veterans. He remembers Civil War veterans, right? So while he was growing up, he was exposed to people that had fought in the Civil War. Now, the interesting thing about this is that that influence still existed. We have to go back 2 lifetimes, just 2, to get back to the Civil War. Now think about that for a second, right? Both of my parents were born before the last Civil War veteran died. That's an interesting thing to think about, that those sort of influences are still there, that our grandparents and great-grandparents knew people that had fought in the Civil War. So the ideologies, the things that influence the people that still believed in owning slaves, right? That say they believed in owning slaves, and then they had kids and then grandkids, and then their grandkids who could be in office today, right? Who could be a legislator today. In fact, we have people that old. Their grandparents and great-grandparents would have had an influence on their decision making, on their cultural development. That history would have been passed on, and it becomes living history. It's not history. It's not just in the history books, but it has been passed on by just a couple generations to where we are today. So it doesn't take that much effort to think about how racism can be continued on through a family generation, right? My grandfather had a massive amount of influence on who I am today. His grandfather, who would have been close to that era, had a huge influence on him. So that transmission of information, right, doesn't have to go that far. And we have seen a massive amount of change in just a few generations. So when we think about that cultural change, when we think about how those certain ideologies are of the past, of history, that's still living history, right? There's still that legacy that is that is there, and it still has to be dealt with, right? How do we deal with it? Because we are still dealing with it, right? So yeah, that becomes really, really important to understand. And it goes even before or beyond that, right? Let's think about wealth for a second, right? How do we look at the transfer of wealth from one generation to the next generation? Oftentimes, that's in possession of a home, right? A home is oftentimes the most expensive thing that you will ever buy in your life, and especially today when houses are so expensive. In fact, many Americans today, aren't necessarily planning on buying their own home because they will never have enough money to buy that home. So it becomes a privilege, unless you have things like generational wealth, right? Your parents die and then pass that money on to you, and then you can use that money to build something, invest it into that home, and then when you die, that money gets passed on to your kids, and so on and so forth. And that's how a lot of wealth and generational wealth has been transferred from one person in a family to the next person. So what happens when you grew up, or your parents or your grandparents grew up in a community where you weren't allowed to buy a house? Right? What if you lived in the projects? Right? And in those projects, all you could ever do is rent, right? Rent goes to an owner and it never goes back to you, right? Uh, you never see that money. You just pay that money to exist, right? Not to grow. So all of a sudden, your parents die and they're penniless. They don't have that generational wealth to transfer onto you. So you've got to really bootstrap, right? To get yourself up there, making that money to, make something. But it's harder, right? Less opportunity. If you grew up in the projects, your education, it's not going to be as good as everyone else. Your opportunities, there's probably less jobs. Those jobs might be more manual labor. Your prospects are less, right? When you're given less opportunity, when you don't have that generational wealth to rely upon. And so owning a home becomes more and more important. And that's where things like HOAs come in, right? Again, HOAs being, one of the first ways that people use to keep out the undesirables, right? They couldn't do it legally because of race, but now they can do it based on income, based on the ideologies and practices of the neighborhood, right? We can decide on whether or not we want you to live there. So there's those institutions that are in place that help to constrain practices, right? And this is where some of that institutional racism comes into place. Again, it's not anyone necessarily enacting an individual practice, right? Sometimes even things like banking. One of the things that when I was working with the Ute Mountain tribe in southwestern Colorado, one of the issues that the tribe faced is that car dealerships were not giving out car loans to people living on the reservation. And the idea is that they were living on the reservation, and if they wanted to buy a car but weren't able to pay off that car, let's say they went into delinquency and stopped making payments on that car, well, the dealership, because of tribal law and federal law, had no right to be able to go onto the reservation and repo that vehicle, right? They didn't have any capability of doing that. They couldn't go onto tribal land and repo that vehicle. So that tribal member, say they couldn't make those payments, would get away with that car. And so the dealerships redlined the tribe, right? And said, we're not going to give out loans to tribal members because we can't trust them. Now, redlining has been a process used for many years. Oftentimes, banks would redline a community and say, okay, we're going to draw this line on this map, and inside that map, that's a really poor community, right? They don't have a lot of access to resources. They're a big liability. So we're not going to give them the same opportunity because we can't guarantee or trust that they're going to be able to, A, use that money that we loan them properly, right? Maybe they don't have the education on how to use that money properly, but we probably won't get it back. And so you have these institutions that make decisions based not necessarily so much on an individual act of racism, right? But an act that is influenced by a legacy of racism. Okay. And that's the thing that we really have to pay attention to, especially in the United States, is the legacy. How do things happen here, happen here, happen here, and happen here? And how do they influence each other? And that's how institutional racism is really impactful, but oftentimes not seen, because it's not something that we see on a regular basis. It's not something that we can look at and say, well, this is obviously racist, right? Because a lot of times it's insidiously racist, but not always seen, right? So when we look at things like home ownership, that becomes a big issue. Okay, so I want you guys to do a quick exercise. Think about institutional racism and how it might take place today, right? What have you seen? What have you heard about? Have you experienced anything like this? What are some of the institutions that might still practice this kind of thing? And then what are some of the consequences that have come about because of it? Okay, we'll pause there and then we'll continue. Think about that and we'll go on to the next segment.